Hey, this is your host, Kofi Thompson here, and welcome to another episode of Breaking the Glass Ceiling. I am super excited today to have our guest, Sam LaCrosse. If you guys don't know Sam, he is a Christian public speaker and writer. He's a multiple-time #1 best-selling author of Value Economics, The Study of Identity, and Toxic Immaturity, Reclaiming the Masculine Identity for Those Who Seek Its Destruction. Additionally, he's the founder and principal of Value Economics Academy, an alternative education company, the host of Value Economics podcasts, and the editor emeritus of the Value Economics Substack. Additionally, he also leads in the men's ministry in his church. Red Rocks Austin is a co-founder of Acumen, an organization devoted to encouraging, equipping, and preparing Christian men to step into their divine purpose. And he's originally from Cleveland, Ohio, but now lives in Austin, Texas. Welcome to the show, Sam.
Kofi, that's a very good. I will give you a little bit of a spoiler on the emeritus part. So I heard that from, I forget who it was, but it was his title of like, he's a magazine publisher. And I said, that is like the coolest title I've ever heard in my entire life. So I'm just going to make that my title of like my Substack. I don't know if it's appropriate or not, but I think you handled that very deftly. So that was a really nice introduction, man. So thank you. Much appreciated.
Absolutely, brother. Absolutely, man. So I don't like to beat around the bush. I really like to dive straight in, on my show. So, in your book, Value Economics, you made a pretty bold statement that the self-help world is a lie. Man. So I'd love for you to just elaborate on what you mean and how you came to that conclusion.
So that's a great question. And it's one that I've been asking myself a lot more recently. I think that's a question that I've really been trying to define, particularly as I've made the book into my entrepreneurial endeavor, Value Economics Academy, going into the next couple of years, hopefully, as we continue to progress and grow and scale and everything. But I saw a lot of problems with the self-help industry because I read a lot of, I would say not a lot of, but a few books that were really core to kind of things that the quote unquote self-help sphere was saying. So I read, Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck by Mark Manson is probably one of the four biggest influential books in my entire life. I've really based a lot of my career off of Mark and his principles. He's the reason I got into writing in the first place. He's the reason I started a blog. He's the reason I kind of reversed his steps from going to Boston down to Austin. He's actually from Austin, Boston. Now he's in California. And so he was a big inspiration for me. And so the way that he was able to craft a narrative surrounding all of like the success culture, clout chasing, valueless, orientationless ability of the self-help industry to corrupt people, I think was a really big influence on me in order to kind of say, what really is pushing people to do the things that they claim to want or say the things they want to do, when in reality, the desires might be different from the actions that separate the person. And so I saw a lot of things that over time really I thought were more destructive than helpful in terms of what advice people were giving others, and really influential people actually were giving others. And so I wanted to I saw this kind of crack in that matrix, and I wanted to kind of see if I could expand it outward and create a little niche for myself. And I think Value Economics did a really, really good job of kind of at least providing an alternative perspective on that. So if people think I'm wrong, they can go to the other stuff. But if people think I'm right, then they can leverage more of my thinking. And so just providing another perspective and another alternative to what was out there was really the big deal. And that was kind of the area I chose to navigate in to really start that conversation off, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely, man. And I really do like your approach to it too, as well, because I feel as though, how can you understand like what help you need if you don't know what your actual goals are and what is truly, your desire authentically to yourself in that regard. So, I mean, I take the same approach when it comes to finances, right? We should be creating a plan based off your goals. So then you know where to go and what you want to achieve at the end of the day. But in order to understand those goals, you truly have to know yourself and what you want and mute all the noise that we get from the outside about what we think will, make us happy. And we think will, produce fulfillment in our lives. So I really love that approach because everything starts internally at the end of the day. So what sparked your interest in learning more about values and, researching and writing a whole book based off of it? What was like the initial spark for that?
That's another good question. It was two primary things. So I would say The first thing I was very lucky to be, if I have any privilege in my life, was that I had a really, really great family growing up. And I had, my mom and dad were great people. I was really surrounded. I had my grandparents close to me. I had my grandma close to me. I had a lot of aunts and uncles close to me. So we were very nucleic, not only inside of my household, but also in kind of the electrons that were rotating the nucleus. So I kind of had a lot of,
Mhm.
different things to ping off of in certain fashions. And so the thing that was always involved in our family's decision making, and a lot of this was impacted by a lot of situations that went down with my family. My sister has a pretty severe a cognitive disability. She has pretty severe autism, and so we were really had to hunker down and be nucleic as a family to kind of rally around her and support her both inside the house and school and whatever. And that really forced us to really look in the mirror and say, okay, what is important? What is valuable to the LaCrosse family, as a unit, as a structure? And I would say my dad, he worked very, very hard to provide for us financially. And he was up at 4 in the morning. He was gone from like 6 until 6. He worked basically 12-hour days for almost, most of his career, honestly, and sometimes longer. And always on off hours, would go in on Saturdays, would do everything he could to make extra money. And so, but he was always home for dinner when he was not traveling. Like he never stayed
Mm.
late. He never went
Mhm.
out really to happy hours or work dinners or anything when he didn't have to. And so I remember very vividly, like just because of the repetition, honestly, a lot of the times he would just come through the door, dinner would almost be ready. He'd sit down and we'd get like a solid like hour or 2 hours with him before he would go wind down for the rest of his day or finish some stuff up from work and whatever, hang out with my mom or something like that. And I remember during, our family dinners, he would always have what I would call these bang the table moments when he would like, he's a very intense guy. I'm less intense than him in some ways, but more intense than him in others. But he would have one of these, what I call bang the table moments, where he would get so riled up about something that either would happen to one of my siblings at school or would happen to me or happened at work or happen with my mom's work or one of her friends or something, where he'd be like, the LaCrosse family stands for this. And he'd hit the table, not in like an aggressive way, but just kind of like an emphatic way. Like, this is what we stand for. This is what we believe. And so
Mm.
this is kind of, that was where the value orientation came up with me. And so it was very, very self-evident from me at a very, very young age, which I later, I think, discovered to be very rare and not really commonplace in a lot of other households. And so what I like to use to describe it as when it was like for me, when I would kind of explain people about how my dad and my mom really oriented our family, was that imagine like if someone randomly came up to you in the middle of the street and asked you to describe in a definitional term what a circle is. And like
Mhm.
you're a smart guy, like what a circle is, but you'd be like, okay, it's like the circumference plus the radius plus all these, whatever the formula is to kind of get a circle. And so it's just something that's like, so you've seen it a million times, right? But you don't really know how exactly what to define it. And so I found that to be a very, very interesting question. Like, what did we actually mean by all of this? And then I remember, to add another point on our earlier discussion on the self-help industry, remember I would used to see I used to be really big into motivational content, particularly when I was in college. Like I remember it was literally in my schedule that when I was eating lunch or eating dinner, I'd pull up like something by Eric Thomas or something by somebody else of that ilk. And I like Eric and I like a lot of the stuff that those people say, but what the constant theme was, a lot of people would come up on a talk or a stage or a podium and
Mhm.
they would say something about values and say how values were critically important to the success of a company, to the success of a family, to the success of an individual person. And then they just move on to the next thing. Like they didn't explain what the values things were. And I said, this is
Mm.
kind of very strange because it was something that was very defined inside of my family structure, but it was apparently not inside of the culture. So I was like, okay, there's definitely an arbitrage of definitional authority here. And so that kind of those two things really kind of set me on this quest to discover really what values were and what roles they had in a lot of different ways. And so that sent me down. And when I started running my blog back in late 2019, early 2020, the first article I wrote besides the, hi, my name is Sam, I have a blog now post, was what ended up being the fourth chapter of the book. And then that eventually spiraled into more chapters. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But that was kind of the impetus of me becoming the values guy in an essence. It was kind of like a very two-pronged approach of a cultural lens and then a familial lens that I
Mm.
think really contrasted one another. And I thought that was very curious, and that led me to want to find out the answer to those things.
No, I love that, man. And I think this is such a great conversation to have because I know that growing up for me, I do believe that, you know, my parents had certain values, but there are oftentimes unspoken values. And it was only through like, I feel like for a lot of people that are, Gen Z or sorry, millennials and below, oftentimes like because they may not have been, in as close relationship with their parents, um, they're Yeah, I think that, not as many families have that solid core of like values. So having those conversations in your young adulthood is so important. I think for me, again, I don't think I really thought about my values until I was like in my early
Yeah.
20s.
Yeah.
That was like the first
Yeah.
time until I really started to intentionally think about, okay, like what are the things that I truly want to stand for? What are the things that, I want to espouse? How am I going to show up in my community? So, man, this is, again, I think it's such a great topic of conversation. So, you had mentioned at one point you were having a conversation with your mother, and she had said that Gen Zers really don't have a consistent set of beliefs that we see in many other generations. So, like, I'm curious to hear like, from your experiences with your peers, do you feel like that's the case?
I I do, in a sense. I think that there is, and to provide some context to that. So this is kind of the genesis of what sent me down the value economics roadway, and really what got me focused on the big identity portion, which I think is a natural coupling to the values portion. And so
Hmm.
I think there's a lot of topic of conversation surrounding identity in our culture nowadays. And so I think that there is, particularly in Gen Z, I think it's especially strange because we are in a time where a lot of us don't know that a place without the internet, where there's a computer in the home with cell phones and all these other sorts of things. And so we have really a sense of there's no uniting and unifying principle that we can really have to our names. And so that
Mm.
has caused a massive splintering of a lot of different types of people, which is why you see these echo chambers either on social media or in, I would say, other types of communities, whether it be cities or not, much less a country. And I think that's really causing a lot of the divisiveness, because when a very divided group of people and a very valueless group of people is driving a majority of the conversation on social media and on these other platforms, then it's naturally going to be a disunifying narrative from everything else. And so I don't think, to your point earlier about yourself, there has not been a good framework for establishing a value-based presence inside of the world. And I think that a lot of people, it's up to you to kind of have the conversation with yourself and have that not natural trial and error process of saying that, okay, this is what I've experienced. This is what I believe to be true. This is how I want to chart my life. And so this is what I'm going to base my life upon. And I think the central problem with Gen Z is that we have a lot of very bad answers to the question of identity. And so
Mm.
fill that gap with a lot of other things that really they say a part of the story and not the whole part of the story. Like I gave a speech at Texas A&M University earlier this week, and when preparing for that speech, my contact over there, who's a lovely man, General Ken Allison, him and I were talking about this, and this is a big passion area of his as well, which is why he brought me in. And we were talking about this, and he said a lot of his students, who are generally, he works with an organization called the Corps of Cadets, which is basically a high level ROTC program at Texas A&M. It's the biggest student organization on campus. And so he works with a lot of the kids and he teaches on these principles. And so he said something to me that I thought was very interesting. He said that a lot of his kids can describe what they are, but not who they are. And I think that might be the central
Mm.
discussion point of what's going on with Gen Z, because a lot of people are separating into these quote unquote identity groups in a lot of
Yeah.
ways, whether it's by race or ethnicity or gender or sexual orientation or political affiliation or religion or something like that. And that can say, a part of who you are, certainly. Like I am certainly fit into all of those categories, but I am very different than a lot of people just by a broad brushstroke, if you would choose to paint me as such. Like I am an individual person. You are an individual person, and a lot of other people are individual people. And so I think the question of identity now is, how do we define identity at the individual level? And that's
Mm.
why I think that's where the values discussion is so important, because your values might necessarily not be my values, and my values might not necessarily be yours, and that's okay. But those can only be determined by saying, my name is Kofi Thompson, and my values are A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and my name is Sam LaCrosse, and saying my values are A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And that can only be done with an internal reflection, not by any outside pressure or conformity or wanting to be a part of something. You have to make that stand for yourself internally. And I think that's where my mother was coming from when she made that comment. And I thought it was an insightful one. And I agreed with it. I just really didn't know what the answer was. But that led me down the values identity track that we are sitting here almost 5 years later after that discussion happened. And now it's become really the central ethos of my whole philosophy, essentially.
I love it, man. That's absolutely awesome. So, we're definitely going to be diving into a little bit about how to build a value system. But, first, I think it's important to understand the why. Like, why should people have these conversations? Why is this important? Why do you feel like having a clear set of values is important in someone's life? And how can that help them navigate life in a better way?
I think the question of that is a question of sovereignty. And I think
Mm,
it's a question of freedom. Because
hmm.
I think that in today's world, in the way that we communicate with one another, in a way that influence is spread, in a way that influence is accumulated by other people, it is a necessity. It is not an option anymore to not be a free thinker if you truly want to be a free person. Because if you allow you are going to be programmed by something in essence.
Yeah.
You are either going to be programmed by yourself or you're going to be programmed by something in the culture. And that's something in the culture, as you very, very well know, we've talked about this a lot off the podcast, but there are a lot of influences in the culture that are certainly there are good influences, but I think there's a lot of bad influences out there as well. And if you aren't careful and don't put up those values inside of yourself, those things can come in and fill you up and corrupt you. And that will take your control away from you. And I say basically, I have a term for this actually inside of the first in the intro of the book. I basically call them purposeless balls of bleh because they are PBBs because they don't really have anything guiding them. And so that's when really tyranny can come in and start to really infect your mind and take control of you. And so what I am calling people to is to be a free and sovereign person by making a stake over their values. Because essentially, if you don't, you are opening yourself up for potential nefarious forces who want to take advantage of you to come in and really wreak havoc on your life. And I don't think that's a very, very good option. And I don't think a lot of people
Hmm.
would, most people would admit that if they wanted to put it in those terms. And so from that standpoint, I wanted to really, I think it's important just to stay sane and have a sense of conviction and really put faith and purpose behind what you're doing. That's just from a survival perspective. But if you really want to get into a thriving perspective, I don't think there's any really person out there who did anything worthwhile in any area of life, whether it's
Yeah.
starting a family or getting married or doing a podcast or starting a company or becoming a doctor or something like that. If they didn't have the internal locus of control and the internal ambition and striving to accomplish whatever that thing is. Like, I don't think anyone accidentally does something great, like become the founder of a very successful startup or a really big media figure or achieve a promotion at work. I think that all has to be internally motivated. And I think when
Hmm.
outsourced to other people, you kind of just shoot yourself in the foot from almost every way imaginable in every aspect of your life.
Absolutely, man. No, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I see, no, there's a great quote. The man who sets his sail, or the wind favors the man who sets his sails.
Mm.
And the reality is that like when you don't have, an anchor, when you don't have something that like can root you down to help you make decisions when various things come up in life, it's so easy because like we're communal animals. Like we
Yeah.
operate within the group. So there's this thing called like group thing. So if a lot of different people are, taking this one action, because we want to be able to survive, we know that, operating in a group is better for our overall ability to survive in any given environment. We are usually going to be pulled by that group's perceptions or beliefs, the actions that they take. And so if we don't have a value system, that environment will change you before you're able to change yourself in that regard. And it becomes very difficult to actually make wise decisions or things that are aligned with you authentically if you again don't have like a value system to base that decision off of and say, all right, am I going to go left or right in that
Mm-hmm.
regard? And I think
Yeah.
that's, you know, as you said, especially in the world we live in today, there's so many different influences out there. I don't know the numbers, but I think it's we see like thousands or hundreds of thousands of different ads every single day, through like social
Yeah.
media and all these different things. So it's so easy to be pulled in all these different directions. You have people talking about what careers you should have, you should start business, all these different things. But if you don't know what's core to you, it's just so easy to get caught up in that person that, has a very sexy voice and, dresses nice and, looks like they're living the perfect life in that regard. So,
Yep.
man, this is it's amazing stuff. I truly love it. So, you had mentioned before, so I want to get into like, values, but I think there's a really important part we should acknowledge first. And you had talked about how your early experiences in childhood can relate to the values that you have. So I'd love for you to elaborate on that apart a little bit on that concept about how our experiences early on in childhood can, impact the values that we have in life.
Yeah, that's a really good question because in the book and in Value Economics Academy with what I do with my clients and the people that are inside of it is that we get into literally like we get very foundational. We get into like literally the question is what is a value? Like we get into the breakdown of like what a value is because that's the central question that I don't think a lot of people can answer. And so we have four ingredients to what a value is, and the first ingredient to a value is your experiences in life, how you perceive the world and everything surrounding it. And so
Mm-hmm.
I would say for me, in terms of early experiences that really shaped my value system, the clear example of something that did it more than anything else was my relationship with my sister. And I
Oh.
would say, so
Mm-hmm.
my sister is about 14 and a half months younger than I am. So we're very close in age, but my sister has pretty severe cognitive disability. She has autism and she has a lot of challenges that a lot of other people did not have. And so what that did for the rest of the family, especially as I look back on it now, was quite interesting because we all had a different response to it in a lot of ways. So to give some context, I have my parents, my mom and my dad, and then I have a younger sister and a younger brother who's the youngest of the three of us. So I'm the oldest child. And so for me, I think naturally, it's funny. I was talking with Kyle Johnson was one of my clients at VEA, and so we talk about this we've kind of dubbed this oldest child syndrome in a lot of ways. And so is the and so he's because he's the oldest three as well. So Kyle and I were talking about, and as the oldest child, you naturally, I think, feel a somewhat parental responsibility to your younger siblings, even though you are not the parent figure. Obviously, the parent's the parent figure, but you are kind of in the big brother, big sister role. So you kind of have an internal instinct of guiding people to where you want to go. And so there's a natural sense, I think, of maturity that sets in from that. And so when your sister is not only younger than you, but younger than you and severely handicapped from a mental and emotional perspective,
Yeah.
that maturity shifts into overdrive in multiple ways. And so you have to really almost become a parental figure. And I think that my sister needed a lot of help in terms of advanced therapies and medication and doctor's appointments and everything like that, which also put a financial strain on the family. So, which forced my dad to kick his work into overdrive. My mom was a
Mm.
part-time worker. She was a physical therapist. And so she did that for a couple days a week. But, other than that, she was like constantly, shuffling us between stuff. Me and my brother both did activities. My brother did marching band. I did a lot of other sports related things and things of that nature. And so my sister had obviously all of her things that she did as well. And so my dad got into a phase where he was traveling a ton for his work, especially as I was in middle and high school, and my sister and I
Mm-hmm.
were kind of becoming in more formative years when we were going through obviously our teenage phases and preteen phases and everything. And so he was gone for probably about a quarter to a third of my childhood because he was just shuffling back and forth around the country. He was going around the world. He was traveling all these places and advancing his career and bringing more money in. So I remember I had to really step up in a lot of ways to be
Mm.
very, very mature in multiple ways. And so whether,
Mm-hmm.
because my mom was so busy with my sister and my brother also had some issues. He was not a school person, so he just needed a lot of attention, help with his homework, all that sort of thing. And so I had to adopt essentially the kid that could have nothing go wrong with him because my other siblings had their own
Yeah.
issues. And so I was, constantly having to, be self-sufficient, be radically, and that's kind of why I'm such an independent and contrarian thinker in a lot of ways, because it's kind of I had to be from a very young age. And so that naturally alienated me from a lot of my peers because my peers were in a very stunted mindset compared to where I was. And that's not because they were stunted thinking or they were obsessively immature or not intelligent or anything like that, but just because I had a unique series of circumstances and they didn't have that level of responsibility from that young of an age. And so
Mm.
that really took a toll on my social life, I would say, from a friend perspective, because I just couldn't relate to people who were my age in a lot of ways, because not a lot of them had severe adversity or struggle in that way in terms of their family. And some of them had other things like their parents got divorced or death in the family or something like that that I didn't have to deal with, but that was mine. And I would say additionally, from the other angle, which I think is really funny looking back on it now, is that I didn't know how women worked because I
Mm.
have my mother, and then usually I think how a lot of guys, and I would imagine it's true in the inverse for women too. A lot of guys learn how women work from their sisters, and for a lot of other reasons. But my sister did not really have honestly much interest in what most modern women did or talked about or
Yeah.
anything. This she was just kind of chilling and doing whatever we were doing and whatever, which was awesome. And I love my sister for that. But I remember walking into high school and kind of seeing like this Pandora's box of, various female archetypes. And I was like, what the fuck is going on? Like, what is this? Like, this is so crazy. And so I remember kind of going through from that perspective. And so those two things really shaped me because I would say my social skills were severely set back from a very, very young
Mm,
age. And it was something that made me very, very insecure and drove a lot of my, I would say, overcompensation in a lot of other areas. But I would say that was mine. And so from that perspective, I would say from other people, early experiences matter a ton. Like it's really, really, I would say, dependent on a lot of other things. And I think, you and I know each other because of our men's group that we're in inside of the Standard. And I think one thing I really am fascinated always is kind of learning more about the backgrounds of some of the people that we know and really everything else, because a lot of them grew up in different circumstances than I did. I didn't grow up in a single parent household. I didn't grow up with a lot of violence in my neighborhood.
mm-hmm.
I didn't go up with a lot of wealth in my neighborhood. I kind of was just generally working middle class. And so I did a lot of those things where it's like I'm seeing how, like, okay, I'm connecting the dot with this person had this happen to them and that's why they do this, or this person
Yeah.
is this way because of this. And so I think in connecting those 2 points, it's very important to understand that your early experiences have a very, very fundamental portion and way of how you see the world. And
Yeah.
I don't think you can underestimate, honestly, how important those things are, particularly in the long run with how you see things and how you view and treat other people.
Man, 1,000%. I agree immensely, man. And, even like thinking about my own story, like I did a lot of work on, myself and really like understanding like who I was, why I did the things I did, why I had the beliefs I had. And like I grew up in an environment in my childhood where like both my parents had like mental illnesses. So my childhood environment was always very volatile. Like there were always like
Yeah.
arguments going on and various, things happening. And additionally, they didn't do well financially. Like they didn't really, pay attention to like their health. So there are so many different things that I saw that, just added on to this chaotic environment that I lived in. So for me, like I, went through a lot of those experiences and drew from that like, some of the really important things for me as I grew up were things like having a sense of security and safety.
Yeah.
Like that is something that's very important to me. Like I really value health. That's like one of the most important things for me. Like I'm very adamant about like, eating right, exercising every single day, doing the right things for my body. I'm very big on like just like growing like as a person and especially taking care of like your mental health because I had all these different experiences. So they really ingrained a lot of these different beliefs in me and I, acted off those beliefs. And I also had unhealthy things as well too. Like I was a big people pleaser. I always
Mhm.
say I'm a recovering people pleaser because
Yeah.
when
Yeah.
I was in my household, like I really had to be very cognizant of how I behave because like it could create a like explosion, in my father for, just something little I may do. So I became really attuned to like how I made people feel and that oftentimes would I would deny like my own feelings or like I wouldn't
Yeah.
be necessarily true to okay like this is what I need in a relationship or this is some of my needs in life because I always had to be attentive to him. So through again doing a lot of self work, having a therapist, all these various things, I was able to really understand that about myself. And then when you can dive deep and understand where your beliefs come from and really clarify what those beliefs and values are, I think that's when you can really only truly start doing the work to say, okay, what things align with who I want to be and what things will I keep, and then what things don't align with me, and do I want to start work on, slightly shifting. So for you, if you were in a place where you didn't uh necessarily you weren't clear on your values or maybe you had values that like you don't feel like you truly align with, where would you start trying to build other values? Like where is the first place that you'd kind of go to and maybe give us a few initial steps about how to build new values?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good question. So I think I'll go back to the other three portions of what I believe a value contains and what we teach at Value Economics Academy.
Hmm.
So basically, it starts with your experiences, how you perceive the world, and then you condescend or not condescend, but you go or bleed into your actions. So what you take
Hmm.
action on and what you actively do. And so because we believe value is built out of action, not of just pure thinking about something, so it's actionable. And then I believe your self-awareness can help expedite that process and your discipline helps refine that process. So basically, those are always good places to start in terms of what you have experienced, what you have done. And I think the other two portions, including discipline and self-awareness, like what are you taking control of in your life in terms of discipline? What are you kind of reining in and what are you kind of really systematizing and processing going forward to help you live a better life? And I
Mhm.
think the most important, if I could recommend a value that is universal across everybody and everything, it would be self-awareness. Because I truly believe that self-awareness is probably the most important trait that a person can possess. Because if
Absolutely.
you cannot regulate yourself, like if you are the person that is constantly talking very, very loudly to the woman at the bar, you are not going to get women to come up to you and enjoy a pleasant conversation with you. You might be a nice
Yeah.
guy, but it's like if you can't regulate that self and say that, okay, maybe I need to turn the volume from like a 10 to like
Hmm.
a 6, then you're not going to be able to probably do that effectively and manage that going forward. So I think self-awareness is the most critical element you can have, even when you are a value-oriented person, because then you need to analyze where you can take your values in terms of, are these values leading to extremes? Am I not leveraging my values enough? Or am I getting that balance right? Where am I going with all of my values here? So I think experiences are a good place to start. And then what you would take action on would probably be my next recommendation. So what do you actively practice? What do you like? Do you value your health? Do you value reading? Do you value knowledge gaining? Do you value community with other people? Do you value going to your religious institution? What are those things that you really can bank your life on that you do? Because what you do takes up a good part of your life, which is probably a good reflection of importance, which is a good reflection of your values. And then what I would say on top of that is always be self-aware of everything. So this is not, to our mutual friend, David Sierka and I talked about this a couple weeks ago. So we actually had a conversation surrounding self-awareness to an extreme leads to self-paralysis. And I thought that was a
Hmm.
really, really good, reflection by him. He's a very smart guy. And when he brought that up, I was like, oh my gosh, it's so right. Because a lot of people, they overthink everything. And I'm a chronic overthinker, so I'm very
Yeah.
guilty of this. And so they overthink everything and they paralyze themselves, which leads them to then getting no value out of anything because they just don't do anything. And they
Yeah.
kind of allow themselves to sit there and don't do anything that really progresses them forward and improves them. And so I would say experiences have to come first and then watch your actions and then be self-aware of the things that you do. And you'll probably have a good, at least starting point to to use your analogy, get that compass down that you need to start creating a value-driven existence for yourself.
Yeah, no, man, I love what you said there. And especially on the point of, extreme self-analysis as well, too. I think we've all, or many of us have experienced analysis paralysis. And I actually picked this up from Thich Nhat Hanh. He's a Buddhist philosopher, and he
I
talks
love him.
about
I have a lot of his books. Yeah.
yeah, he's absolutely amazing. And he talks about how, things are what they are based off of what they do, essentially. So, a flower is a flower because it blooms. A cloud is a cloud because it floats. If it was on the ground, it'd be fog. So like human beings are human beings because we take action and we create in the world. That is like the essence of like being a human. And, you know, I think definitely in the world we live in, society has become, a lot easier. There's a lot less things that we have to, do to live in life. So we have this now luxury to spend a lot of time thinking and reflecting.
Yeah.
And I think it's so important to, again, think and reflect to understand like why you take actions. But there's another side of that too, is like if you spend too much time in that phase of thinking and you're just, considering all those things, you're not taking action, but life can only happen. You can only truly, be in your human essence if you're taking action and if you're creating in the world.
Yeah.
So, even like I think that individuals and, companies kind of follow a similar cycle in a weird way. But, at any point or typically like for example for my company quarterly like I'm going through and I'm seeing okay like what are my goals for the company, what are the goals for my clients, how can we align what we're doing in a better way, what are the things that we should potentially change to get to our North Star a bit better. And I think in that same way people should reflect on what they're doing to make sure that they're aligning their trajectory towards where they want to go. But that should be something that should be done in like a periodic,
Hmm.
periodic
Absolutely.
time. You should be
Yeah.
spending more time taking action than you are, just thinking because nothing happens when you take action at the end of the day. And, there's always so many different answers to, any given problem. So it's so important, you know, take an action, because even just by taking that action, even if you're not 100% sure of it, you are going to learn from that experience, and then you're going to have more wisdom to take into the next interaction, that you have.
Yeah.
So no, I think that's all, man. I love it. I love it. So um I'm curious, like for you, what would you say are some of your like most important values?
So the interesting part about this was that I became a Christian after I wrote the book, or the most of the book. So I didn't even have anything related to my religious faith inside of here. And so my faith is definitely the thing that I value the most inside of my life. So my relationship with my God that I have chosen to be true in terms of all these things. And so my relationship with God is the most important thing in my life. And I always recommend, and I say this in the book too, that self-awareness and discipline really have to be, I would recommend those two values to anybody. I value those very highly. And I think, those things have really kept me on track throughout as I've navigated particularly these last 5 years of my life that have kind of had a lot of major life decisions behind them. And I think another good one that I have really rounding out my value pie chart is responsibility and authenticity. I value those things very, very highly. And so I think that I have come in contact with a lot of people over the last couple of years. I work at a company currently where that has 140,000 employees in it. So I interact with a lot of people for them all the time. And I have network and community in a lot of other places. And so I don't think that there is a person inside of any of those groups, and I'm very proud to say this, that thinks that I'm bullshitting them or like trying to spin them about my personality or like what I'm actually about, because I'm just so open about it. And I think that that's where a lot of people, I think, are afraid to let themselves be truly known in that fashion. And so I,
Mm-hmm.
over time, and to your point about insecurity, I was about the most insecure person that I have ever met for a good portion of my life. And recently, I think I've become almost the exact opposite of that, for better or for worse. But I think overall, it's a very big net positive. And I think the responsibility portion, I'm a big fan of Jordan Peterson, I'm a big fan of Jocko Willink, and that's really what a lot of those guys talk about. It's their central ethos, essentially, is that responsibility and taking on burdens for yourself leads to greater returns down the line. And so I would say my faith, self-awareness, discipline, responsibility, and authenticity would be the five that I value most highly.
I love that, man. Man, and it's again, it's so important to like understand those values, for our audience that is listening to this, like really digging deep and understanding like what those values are for you. Again, they help you make better decisions in life. And, another thing that you had mentioned, that, based off what you sacrifice, that oftentimes can be a good indicator as to what you value. I think that is um such a great point to make, because I realized that for me, as I started to, really consider what my values are, I feel like probably in my mid 20s, that's the point at which I started to say, hey, okay, like these are, the values that I have, and these are the values who I want to espouse and things like that. But the reality is a lot of those values were like influenced by like people that I saw and people that I wanted to try and, become, people that were aspirational inspirations for me, and people that I, wanted to align with. But then I started to realize that I didn't necessarily sacrifice things in alignment with those values. So I start to look at my actions, right? Okay, one thing that I, really do value is discipline and like productivity. Another thing that I also value is freedom as well too.
Mhm.
So oftentimes I would, get to a point where I have to make a decision. No, man, like, am I going to go to bed early tonight? And am I going
Yeah.
to wake up at
Yeah.
5 o'clock? Or am I going to be free and, watch the Netflix show and, eat whatever I want and do all the things, right? So I would oftentimes pick like the freedom, early on, because, and again, I still said I had these values of discipline, but it created this like a lot of like self-esteem and self-confidence issues in me, because I kept, making the wrong sacrifice. So I believe another important thing to understand is that a lot of people are going to have many different values, but ordering the values of how important this is to you, and almost like
Yeah.
saying, prioritizing, hey, my value of discipline is higher than my value of freedom. So in order for me to, feel good about who I am and truly live into my authentic self, I sometimes have to say, hey, no to freedom and say yes to discipline at the
Mhm.
end of the day. And a
Yeah.
lot of those, without even prioritizing what your values are, again, like this is something that I think is so important to be able to have a basis to then make decisions off of, because everyone is going to be many times in life where you're going to have to make a decision that does conflict of some value that you may have.
Yeah.
But once you know like what is a higher priority value, then you can say, all right, like I am going to make this decision that aligns with this, at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I have a whole basically rule on this inside. It's like really the foundation of what I call value economics is the value sacrifice trade-off. And so to your
Mhm.
point, there are things, I don't, I think you can tell, and it's almost a one-to-one equation as far as my bro math is concerned about, the relationship between how much you value something and how much you're willing to sacrifice for that something. And so, I think a good relationship to how, and, to your earlier question potentially as well about how much do I really value something? Say, okay, what are you willing to give up for that thing? And so for me, for all the values I just listed, I'm willing to sacrifice a lot of things. And I currently am in the process of sacrificing a lot of things, with myself and my career to achieve full maximization of all of those things. And I think, it's a beautiful point you made too about the hierarchical concept of values in general, because to your point, we cannot, there's the tired phrase, a man who values everything values nothing. And so you
Mhm.
need to have things that take precedent over something else. You need to have a decision tree kind of broken out for everything else here. Like, because I know you. And so you have, I don't know how in the hell you do the outside cold plunge at like 37, I don't know, the apartment pool or whatever that you sneak into or whatever, but like I see you like you put in work every single day to do all those type of things. And so you're lifting weights, you're running, you're doing your cold plunge, you value your health, you're eating well, you're doing all these things. But to your point on the freedom element, I think a lot of people are saying they just kind of go the complete opposite way and say, like, I'm just going to go completely, no boundaries, no constraints, no anything around anything else. I'm just going to let myself go. And so it's like, okay, that's fine. But are you really wanting to maximize freedom at the sacrifice of everything that you have, which is a vital personality, a developed self, a sense of discipline, a sense of routine, a sense of ambition and confidence, and all of the things that come as a byproduct from doing all the things that you value. And so it's about
Mhm.
values is, and that's why I call it a trade-off, because economics in many ways, you're a financial advisor, you know this very well, and probably
Mhm.
much better than I do, is that, it's a system of trade-offs. Are you wanting to maximize growth? Are you wanting to maximize, probably safety and security, return, whatever you want to do in terms of your investments and whatever. And so that's, I think, a cool part of the value economic system that is really explained throughout the course of the book, is that I designed it off of financial and economic principles for a reason, because I think it's a really good analogy for how to
Mhm.
explain really resources in general and not just money. But I think values is a really important part of that discussion too, which is why I really decided to make the framework what it was essentially.
Absolutely, man. I love it. So, do you believe that people with conflicting values can be in relationship together?
This is a really good question. So I am of the belief that to a certain degree, yes, but to a certain degree, no. And so
Okay.
I think it depends on what your value hierarchy is like. And I think because I, we're seeing one of the most interesting things that I've come out that's come out of recently is there was a data set that came out. I forget who took this data set or who did this polling, but there is a startling report out of Gen Z right now. So people who I think are a little, I think they did a survey of random 18-year-olds across the country or something. This is a couple
Mm-hmm.
of years ago. And so they showed that men and women are diverging very rapidly on political lines. And so a lot of young men are trending more conservative. A lot of young women are trending even more liberal than they traditionally are. And
Mm-hmm.
so a lot of that, I'm guessing, for that demographic of people is going to be a deal breaker for people. Like politics is a deal breaker because I think in a lot of ways, not in all ways, certainly, but in some ways, something like politics is a reflection of your values. And I am of the personal belief that as a Christian or as a religious person of any denomination, it's I don't know if it's impossible. I don't think it's morally right, but I don't think it might not be impossible, but it would be very difficult for a Christian and a Muslim, to use an example, to be in a romantic relationship together, because the value
Mm.
systems and what they're basing their life on are so fundamentally different. And that can cause a whole slew of problems, ranging from how you raise your children to your marriage ceremonies to the traditions that you practice, for how you schedule your calendar, for how you do everything else. And so it's not saying that people can't be friends and can't be cordial with one another, because
Yeah.
I think that some of the best conversations I've ever had, like one of my best relationships inside of our men's group is with Abdi Muhammad. And Abdi and I have just the most fascinating conversations. But the reality of the situation is that we have very different lines in terms of religious faith, me being a Christian, him being a Muslim. And so
Hmm.
the reality is I can never know Abdi the way that Abdi truly is because I don't understand that part of him and him with me and vice versa. So I would say from a romantic context, I would just say choose the person very wisely on a value oriented perspective. And for some people, that can be very tough, particularly from, if you live in a certain area of the country that is
Yeah.
like if you are one of these 18-year-old, liberal women, and then you move to a place in the deep South, for example, like it's probably going to be very, very hard to find someone who is going to
Yeah.
agree a lot of the things. And then the inverse is true in and of itself. So I think that romantic relationships are very interesting, especially now, because there are so much or there is so much difference in terms of the values that men and women are holding together. And so to navigate that is I think getting tougher. It's not impossible, but I would say it just depends on your system of values and what you agree on. But I think that in general, I would say no, that a value oriented
Mm.
relationship is the only way to go if you want to be romantically involved with someone for the long term. I just don't think it can be sustainable over the long term from what I can see.
No, you do bring up a lot of great points, and I believe what you run into is compatibility. You're right. Are
Mhm.
you guys compatible enough to then cultivate like a good relationship? And I think that, in my opinion, when you do have a lot of conflicting values, it also creates a lot of potential conflict, of course, right? There's going to be
100%.
a lot of
Yes.
different points that, are going to be points of tension in that relationship. As you mentioned, how you decide to live your life, what type of lifestyle, how you raise your kids, all these different things. So I do believe that it really makes it more difficult. Um, in my opinion, I think it can work, but only for very, very few people. I think
I
that it
agree. Yes.
does
Yes.
require a considerable amount of self-awareness, a considerable amount of conflict resolution strength within both people, and
Hmm.
also like a considerable amount of acceptance to what someone else's other belief is. Because I've found that if you were able to look at similarities between two people, like your relationship with Abdi, and also you know respect that other person's beliefs and not be I not try to change them, but more so like say, hey, like this is someone and I'm going to honor them for their differences and
Yeah.
see them for who they are, and then have conversations and figure out how we can work together and align on different things. I think that can happen. And I think, at its core, like diversity is extremely important, in our, world, right? Like that's how we, are able to solve different problems by taking people
Sure.
from different perspectives. But for a lot of people, they tie themselves so down to their value system and their identity, which we're going to be diving into next year, that it becomes a very core part of them. And so when you disrupt that, they take it as like a personal thing, and then they now get
Yeah.
defensive. I think, for me, like one thing I've learned is be curious instead of condemning, which is very much easier said than done. But I think that when we can move in the world and really be more curious, and also understand why too. Like there was this really great guy, I forgot his name, but he was on Tom Below's podcast. But he talked about one of the big problems that we have in today's society is that everyone's arguing their points, just constantly, but there isn't as much of like, hey, like let me understand why you think the way you do, and
Hmm.
let me understand where those beliefs come from. Because when you go that route, you oftentimes will find that there's a lot more congruence and there is separateness in that regard. But I think again, like it's
Yeah.
very difficult, and it really takes two very self-aware people that are willing to do more work to
Yes.
make that happen in that regard. Man.
Absolutely.
So yeah, definitely I want to switch gears here, because after you do this work and build up your values, this now can create this identity, right? And so there's so many different conversations that we have about identity. There's many different very knowledgeable, intelligent psychologists that have talked about identity. So how would you describe identity, and why do you feel it's important to build an individual identity in the world that we live in today?
So identity is basically how you perceive yourself in terms of what you're comprised of as a human being. That's the way I like
Hmm.
to describe it from people. And that is something that is self-determined, that is a negotiation between yourself and the world. I think this is a really, to your point about, I actually want to use that to kind of articulate what you just said earlier. And I think that this is a very alarming issue we're having in the identity conversation right now, to be honest, is that when people have an offense taken against a part about them, an identity piece of them, they take it as not only an insult, but a existential threat to their sense of existence. And that's a major issue if people think that about their own identities and kind of the very fragile things that make them up, particularly on the surface. And so,
Hmm.
for example, this is, I think, something that I learned from Jordan Peterson, and who learned it from a guy named Jean Piaget, who was a very famous psychologist who learned from him. And so Piaget studied a lot about children and the subject of play and how they interacted with one another when they played games in the playground or in, whatever, and stuff like that. So basically, how he articulated that children really played together and how they were able to see which children would be most successful is that, they had, when they went and organized a game in the playground, for example, there had to be rules inside of that. And so a kid couldn't come in and say, nope, we're scrapping all those rules and we're just doing it. Like, so let's take a basketball analogy, for example. Like, so I'm not a very big I'm the most unskilled basketball player I ever meet, but
Same.
my understanding, you cannot go more than 3 steps without dribbling the basketball unless
Yeah.
foul gets called on you and then the possession switches to the other team. So if I go in there like the Kool-Aid man and just say, I don't have a dribble at all, I'm just going to sprint down the court and then dunk it on the other side of the thing. Like, that's obviously, like, that's not cool. You just can't do that. And
Yeah.
so, and the same is true with how you go inside of yourself. You cannot make people accept you. You have to kind of have a negotiation between yourself with everybody else.
Mm.
And that's not saying that people shouldn't be decent and accommodating towards a new person in a new situation. Like, you should be nice to the new kid when he comes into class because he's probably feels very afraid, feels very out of
Hmm.
place, out of water type of thing. But if that person tries to be tyrannical about it, that's a whole different conversation. And so I think that is, I think the essential problem of the cultural conversation around identity right now is that we're determining it at a group level, not at an individual level, which is fine for some degrees. Like, I do think that it is important to acknowledge identity groups in terms of different races and genders and sexual orientations and things like that, and say that these people have a common thing together. They have this trait about themselves, but I think it's equally as important, and more important, I should say, to go deeper than that and analyze them at the individual level. They are not just categorized as this thing, they are more than that thing. And they have all these different things about them. They have hopes and dreams and values and relationships and everything that make up so much more of them than just a surface level characteristic about themselves. And so that's why I wanted to focus so much on individual identity, because I believe I have a phrase that I've somewhat popularized since I started the book, that the non-tyrannical collective begins the non-tyrannical self. And I think to be
Hmm.
a non-tyrannical self, you have to be resistant to tyranny. And how you're resistant to tyranny is by creating a fortitude inside of yourself that's comprised of the right elements, which is leading into the values and identity portion around everything else. And so I saw that really as the central problem with a lot of the people in my generation. And that's why I think a lot of people are struggling with it, and why I wanted to build a system to kind of combat that.
Mm. No, that makes complete sense there. And so, in my opinion, and I am no expert whatsoever, I do feel like we're starting to move from more like collectivism to more like of an individualistic kind of, mindset. So do you feel that, shift is, becoming more of a net positive or more of a net negative, for society?
I think it's a little bit of both, and I think it's kind of we're kind of seeing. I do think we're seeing less emphasis on the collectivized portion. To your point, I think people are kind of over that, and we're kind of getting more atomized in terms of this is me, this is Sam, this is Kofi, this is whoever this is. And I think it's all about. I get into I actually have a whole chapter and whole section of the academy about this portion about excess. And so you said earlier, kind of, people taking values, but there's a certain degree where that value can go out of control and it becomes extremism and not a value.
Hmm.
And so this
Yeah.
is, I think, the easy example is like a religious person, for example. If a religious person takes their faith to such an extreme and so out of context, they become not a Christian or a Muslim. They become like a white nationalist or a jihadi or something like that. So they take
Hmm.
that they kind of something else where they just go completely off the deep end and go really, really radical with everything. And so that can happen with almost every single value that you take. And this is something that, Jocko Willink wrote a book about this called The Dichotomy of Leadership, which I think is really, really good. And so he basically says that there is a certain degree where it's like you can call like you can value being a hard worker, but if you're spending 22 hours at the office and you're neglecting your wife and children, like that's a problem at the end of the day. There's a diminishing return there that needs to, kind
Hmm.
of be balanced out in some way. And so I think the individualism I think is fine, but I think to your point, this is a lot of what I'm working on. I'm almost done with my third book now, and this is a lot of what this is now. We're getting to almost an expressive individualist identity where we're getting so atomized at the individual level that we are kind of not fighting between groups anymore, but we're fighting between empowered radical individuals at this point. And
Yeah.
so we're kind of doing the thing that we discussed earlier, where it's like, I am going to make you accept me. And the other person says, I'm going to make you accept me and this and that and this and that and whatever. And then that just leads to chaos and all types of bad stuff. So I think if we do it right, individualism is very, very good because I believe that
Hmm.
a person should be judged, like I've said throughout the conversation, at the individual level. And I do believe that they should be I'm not going to judge Kofi because of his job or because of where he came from or his socioeconomic status or whatever.
Hmm.
I'm going to judge Kofi Thompson off of Kofi Thompson. And I'm not going to really factor all those things in. But if Kofi Thompson starts to kind of get kind of wild and say, like, I am going to dominate people, I'm going to do this, I'm going to make you
Yeah.
say these things about me, I'm going to make you say that I'm like the best financial advisor, this part of the Mississippi,
Hmm.
whatever. It's like, I think that could kind of become a problem. And that's, I think, where to your point about the radicalized individualism we're seeing, that's where it can go off the deep end, I think. So it's all about how
Mm.
we really navigate that transition. And so it can go either way. So I guess, we're going to be in for a ride to see which side wins, I guess. So we'll see.
Yeah, no, I think you bring up some really amazing points there. And I see it as like there are two extremes of collectivism and individualism. And like there's also like this like almost healthy balance, between the two. And to put in like a really like simple metaphor, like, imagine like a basketball team. Like if we had everyone was a point guard on one team, like
Right.
that team is going to collectively kind of have the same identity, but there's no going to be like individual characteristics that could really help that team become an all-star championship team, because it's just going to be all the
Yeah.
same people. They're going to have all the same flaws and all the same weaknesses at the end of the day.
Yes.
But in that same regard, on that basketball team, you're going to have different players and different positions, and you don't want someone to be such an individual that they're not worrying about the collective and understanding
Mhm.
how they actually fit inside the group and how their strengths and weaknesses will you know help the group become better as a whole, essentially how they complement other people's strengths and weaknesses as well too. And I think
Mhm.
that's like one thing that in my opinion, what we're kind of individualism, I think, is an amazing thing. I think that every person should find their calling, should understand who they are, in their self outside the groups that they're in, but also understand that we do live in a group, and it's so important to then take your identity and who you are and say, all right, how can I use like my strengths and weaknesses to help better serve, my community, help better serve,
Right.
all these different things. And, not think that I can just go become an individual and isolate myself and live in a forest, and all the different things, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's it's a hard balance to have, but I think it's, really important there. So do you feel, there are consequences for people that don't work on building their identity as they find their career and, start their relationships?
I do, because I think it goes back to the point of if you do not have a sense of self, then a sense of self will get imported on you from other people. And this
Hmm.
is where I think, I'm far from a relationship specialist, but this is where I think a lot of codependence comes from inside of a relationship, where, if a guy gets into a relationship with a girl, the girl is very well defined in terms of her sense of self, the guy is not, then he is going to depend on the woman for his identity. And everything that she says imports into him. That is not a healthy way for anyone to live, because, again, you're not a sovereign or free person. You're essentially dependent on another person to give you everything that you need to be given. And I would say, as a person who has worked in corporate America now for 4 years, I see this all the time, unfortunately, with a lot of people. They just kind of become cogs of the company and they just start parroting the company's values and everything like this. And it might not be that good for them, honestly. And I see this a lot with
Hmm.
young people and people that are around my age. And so I see people, they ask no questions. They ask no, they don't really push back on anything inside of the company, whether it's something that they find offensive or anything else, just because they want to, be a part of the club and go to the happy hours and go on the business trips and everything else inside of it. And so, and there's nothing wrong with those. Those are fine. But I think that at the end of the day, you do need to have a sense of yourself and a sense of identity going into any situation, because there are powerful forces out there, man. And if you are not a
Yeah.
powerful person of yourself, that is going to be a recipe for disaster, in my estimation.
Yeah, no, absolutely, man. And I want to, bring up another point as well too, because, not only can the external, impact our identity, and this actually, comes from some research by Freud. And I was reading about Freud, and he, created the psychoanalytic framework and essentially said that the mind is composed of the id, which is driven by instinct and desire, and the superego, which is driven by morality and values. And then you have the ego, which, moderates the two and creates one's identity. And many aspects of that go into that, like your insight, your agency, empathy, purpose, all those different things. And what I found for me, that before I actually went and did the work and created my identity, my actions were very controlled by my id.
Yeah,
I
right.
was very
Yeah.
driven by my
Yeah.
desires. I was very
Funny.
driven by that, that animal brain essentially, because I didn't
Yeah.
have the identity. So I would always just, seek, okay, what makes me feel the happiest in this moment? What is, again, the short-term gratification? What are the things that I'm doing that's just making me, feel good in the moment? But because I didn't have that, super ego, or that ego to, like, help moderate my id. So you become so driven by, like, so many short-term things that happen in your life if you don't, from what I found, if you don't form that identity. But then when you form that identity, you're then able to say, okay, let me now, moderate some of my actions and really understand, okay, what is, my morality? What is my philosophy? What are some of the things that I think are important in the long term, so that I'm not just driven by desire.
Yeah.
Because the reality is that for a lot of those people that are just, purely leading their lives by desire, they may feel happy for that moment when they eat that piece of candy, but the
Right.
reality is that doesn't really create any, like, long-term, fulfillment at the end of the day. So,
Mhm.
I think it's so important. So do you feel, our identities are consistent over time, or do you feel like it, tends to change, as life changes?
I think it definitely changes. So basically, I think that in terms of values and in terms of where you go from there, it does change throughout your life, just as I think that there's a good investing analogy here. Like, you're not going to invest at age 80 the way that you invest at age 20. And so
Mm,
there are things
mhm.
that change throughout everything else, because when you invest older, you want to put it in more, I would say, safer investments, and younger, you want to grow your wealth and then start building the nest egg up so you can start harvesting and compounding over time. And so I think similarly with your values, you need to treat it, and this is kind of what chapter 3 in the book is all about. It's called about, allocating your values into basically your essential value portfolio, and what you want to put inside of it, and how you select for values, and how you put inside of everything else. And so, for example, the way that you will not act when you're single is most likely going to change when you get married, and even more so when you have children, and even more so when you have a responsibility as like a little league softball coach, or a teacher, or a career change or something like that. So, and that's going back to the self-awareness portion. That's where the self-awareness thing really, really comes into play. Because if you are not aware when you are entering changes of your life that you yourself are going to change, then that's a massive threat to, I think, where
Mhm.
we currently stand. And so that is going to be, I think, a really, really just powerful thing for a lot of people as they go through changes. And that's something that, even with me, I wrote the book on values, and I've changed my values a bunch ever since I've written the book. And so it's kind of been a really big explorative process from that standpoint, because you change because of a lot of things, but I think your values need to change with it and adapt with it, or else, like, you can't be rigid, because if you're rigid, then you can break
Yeah.
easy, I think.
No, I think you're on point there, because, not only do developmentally, as we go through different stages in life, like, our values will inherently, or should, change,
Yeah.
right? You're not going to be the same person that you were in your early teens, in your early 30s. But also, like, as we take on different roles in society, like, I believe that our values should also, change or shift as well too. I think that a lot of people, tend to build up, like, a certain identity and, like, act in accordance with that because of the environments that they're in constantly. So say, for example, this happens for a lot of, people that are business owners, like high level level executives, like they've gone to one way of handling relationships, right?
Yeah.
They may be in a
Yep.
point where they have to make a lot of different decisions. They have to kind of be more strict and, a little bit less emotional and, in the work that they do. But if they take that same, identity and take that into their family, it can be a little destructive towards those relationships that
Absolutely.
they have with
Absolutely.
their wife and their kids. So it's so important to not only, know that our values are evolved, but also really be cognizant of what are the values that we have depending on the roles that we're currently in at that moment, right? So
Yeah.
I am going to be, I'm have certain different values that I espouse, like when I'm operating as a financial advisor for someone. And then when I'm going out and, I'm with friends and I'm with people that I'm just hanging out with, I'm going to be a little bit different. I'm not going to necessarily show up as that same exact
Yeah.
person in every single environment that I'm in. And, it's good to be adaptable and not be, so fixed, to a certain, identity in that regard.
Hmm. Absolutely. I love that.
So, how would you say, our identity or even, I guess, social circles, how would you say like social circles play a role in our identity, the various social circles that we're in throughout
Yeah,
life?
I would say peer pressure is a really big portion on the negative side. And I would
Yeah.
say there, I have a quote that I say to myself all the time is that you really don't respect a person if you don't respect their evolution.
Mm,
And I think your social circles, if they clap for you when you win and you're making a big change, and they say like, heck yeah, man, like go ahead and keep going, keep progressing, keep doing all those things. It can either reinforce your values or dismantle your values and discourage you from your values. So if you're around people that really say like, I think, I've heard this unfortunately from a lot of people inside of our group when, we get the beautiful suits that, Joe Hines makes for us and everything that, when we start dressing out more and stepping out and doing all these things, they get comments from some people, unfortunately, that say like, hey man, like, why are you dressing like that? You trying to show me up? You're trying to do like all these things, trying to make me look bad, trying to do
yeah.
whatever. And it's like, no, like not really actually. And so I'm just trying to dress better and, have a different sense of perception about myself. But there are going to be other people, at least hopefully, that will say, hey man, like that's a really awesome suit. Like you look great. And,
Mhm.
I really, see that you're taking yourself more seriously and you're leveling up here, which is awesome. And so I think social circles have a really interesting role because they can either be a very big propellant or they can be like an out of control emergency brake on your
Mm.
evolution as a person, where it's like they can just yank you very, very far behind. Or when you have the proper reinforcement, they can really be quite a profound accelerant on your identity from so many different perspectives, I think.
Yeah, man, absolutely. I agree, 1000%. I find that social circles have played such an important aspect on like who we are and how we show up in the world because again, we're communal animals. We
Yeah.
are going to act in accordance in a way that appeases the group so we can, fit in better. So oftentimes in life, like people may not be as intentional about the social circles that they're in. And I think that can be one of the biggest detriments to just overall happiness and fulfillment because if you are just, moving into the closest social circle that's around you and what's in your community and all these various things, oftentimes people have like midlife crises because they aren't actually intentional about like who they want to be around and they let this group think kind of just really shape a lot of their actions and beliefs. But
Yeah.
it's I think this is such something that's so important for our listeners, like be intentional about the people that you spend time with, be intentional about your social circles because there's a great quote, don't judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, right? And so if
Yeah.
you
Right.
are, in a space where your values are conflicting, you're not going to feel you can truly represent yourself and you can really, let your light shine in that regard. And it
Yeah.
oftentimes can feel very isolating. Again, if you're around a lot of people that just, again, they conflict with a lot of your core values. Man, so there's one, last thing that I want to touch on before we wrap up this interview, and it's just about how values or so how identity, can truly impact our personal relationships, our careers, and our lifestyle. So, the reason why I bring this up, because I feel like I've had so many conversations about this. And just recently, I was having a conversation with a good friend of mine. And, she is, in the process of dating right now and, trying to find like the right partner for her.
Yeah.
But for her, when she grew up, she, you know, would lived in a like kind of a family dynamic where she always had to like appease, like her parents very much. And she was very much like a people pleaser. And, they oftentimes may not have showed her secure, they didn't have like a secure attachment style in that regard. It wasn't like a healthy,
Mhm.
sense of like, reinforcing love and like really being very affectionate. So she is more guided towards, or she kind of flows more towards guys that, have a more avoidant attachment style. Like
Sure.
she's
Yeah.
more attracted to people that
Yeah.
don't really, give her much attention in that regard.
Yeah.
And, I just want to mention this because I think it's such an important thing to understand because if you don't know what your, how your experiences are now shaping your identity and the decisions that you're making, those decisions will essentially dictate the experience that you have in life. Right.
Mhm.
So if you don't actually dig down into the room and be like, okay, why am I like attracted to like a certain person? Why do I make these decisions?
Mhm.
At the end of the day, you're just going to keep facing the same result. So if you're, not doing the work to say, yeah, again, go back and understand why we have these certain attractions, why we like the things we like, why we make those decisions, it becomes nearly impossible to make a different decision and get a different result. And again, that's just something I want to really mention because I believe identity and the values we have in these experiences dictate so much about our lives, but oftentimes they are unconscious to us as we
Mhm.
operate. But bringing them up to a conscious level and actually being intentional about making these decisions allows you to live much better life.
I think it does too. And I think that there is to use, I think the point about your friend, I think there's a concept that one of my favorite concepts I've ever come up with, or actually I didn't come up with it, Mark Manson came up with it, but I appropriated it from Mark. So thank you to Mark. But I think that basically when you adopt a value-oriented identity and or a value-based identity, you are going to, by definition, polarize people. And so you are going to get people who say, I like this person's values and people that say, I do not like these person's values. And I believe your ability to achieve the things that you want to do in your life, whether it is work related, relationship related, career related, finance related, whatever, is going to be highly dependent on your ability to polarize people in a
Mm,
constructive fashion. And so, because polarization works both ways, and a lot of people don't see the other side of it, unfortunately, a lot of the time, because polarization gets people away from you, right? It's like a magnet principle. So it gets people away from you, but it also really attracts people to you from a lot of ways. And so the way that I got this from Mark Manson, so before he wrote Subtle Art, he wrote, in my opinion, the best dating book that's ever been written called Models. And
mhm,
so he wrote that book and he talks about this situation where it's like you're in a romantic situation with a person and you want to let your values be known very, very firmly. So you can either really attract the person to you or really repel the person from you. So you can either get a person really into you or you can get them very away from you. And I think that that is a very similar thing with values and with other people inside of relationships. If you can convey your values effectively, then I think you'll have probably maybe fewer relationships, at least initially, but you'll
mhm.
have better relationships. And I think that if
Yeah.
you do that over a longer time horizon and you get into better communities and you use that self-awareness properly, your relationships will both be of quality and of quantity, even though if the quantity is or the quantity is going to be significantly less in the front end and more so at the back end. So what I always like to harp that point home from people because it's a scary thing for sure, because to your point about, you've mentioned it multiple times to, your credit about kind of the pack animal mentality and we want to be a part of a tribe and we
Mhm.
want to be a part of a certain group of people. And there is definitely room for that. I love that people rather that are involved in community, where no matter what that community is. And so, but to form a community is formed generally around shared values. And you can't have shared values if you don't have values, and you don't have shared values unless you have something to share. And so if you
Yeah.
don't share those with other people, then bipolarizing and letting people know about your values, then that's not going to get there in the first place. So I would say from that angle, polarization is really key, and the ability and the courage to show people that you do have values is unbelievably important, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Man, this has been an absolutely awesome episode. And so, have a couple final questions for you as we wrap up here.
Yeah.
So, I want to give you a scenario. Let's imagine, you're on your deathbed and you have the opportunity to leave three pieces of advice for the community to help them strive and become the best version of themselves. What three pieces of advice would you leave?
I would say tell the truth. I think the truth is a very, very, it's the most important thing you can do is tell the truth. I would say know what's important to you, know what you value in many ways. And I would say three, be bold and courageous in action. So know what's
Mm,
true, know what is important to you, and then be very overly courageous on acting on both of those things.
I love it. I love it. So, next question: how would you describe someone who is breaking their glass ceiling?
Someone who shatters the glass. And so I don't think that someone can, at least I guess I don't know. I've never done this before, fortunately, I guess, but I think someone who breaks a glass ceiling naturally has to be somewhat disruptive. And I
Mm,
think that no matter whether that is someone in a different demographic in work or someone in the social scene or someone in, business or I'm a big fan of people who challenge the narrative and are contrarian about something in a way that's just and in a way that's righteous. So I think it's someone who isn't afraid to break glass. And so I would say that that person needs to be very cognizant that they are disrupting the narrative. But if they're doing it from a just and righteous purpose, then they should take a lot of pride in that. And I certainly do when I try to.
I love that, man. I love that. So, is there anything coming up, Sam, that you'd like to promote or share for our audience?
So, and not really much of anything. So, Value Economics Academy is my alternative education company that I've created out of this book. And we're seeing guys and girls, soon to be, hopefully, have some major breakthroughs with a lot of things they're dealing with, ranging from addiction, porn, alcoholism, starting podcasts, starting a bunch of other things inside of it, which has been super cool. And also doing a lot of the value identity and identity work that you and I have talked about, Kofi, throughout the process. So, Value Economics Podcast, Value Economics Substack, and working on my third book, working on hopefully a novel by the end of the year, and a lot of really cool stuff to come in terms of content. A YouTube channel as soon as well. So a lot really going in on more content and more hopefully cool stuff that people can enjoy and get value out of. So thanks for having me on, Kofi. I really appreciate it, man. This is a ton of fun.
Yeah, absolutely, brother. And what are the best ways people can connect with you? They'd like.
Yes, absolutely. So it's lacrosse like the sport, only with a capital C on social media. And also my social media ats are almost all, except for the future YouTube channel, going to be at Real Sam LAX.
Awesome, awesome. And that'll definitely be in our show notes, guys. Thank you again, Sam. This has been an absolutely awesome episode. And I know that there's so many people that are going to be have more clarity when it comes to understanding what their values are and also who they are as a person and the best ways to show up in the world. So I really appreciate you coming on, brother.
I appreciate you having me, Kofi. This is a lot of fun, man. Thank you. This is a blessing.
No doubt. We'll see you guys soon on Breaking the Glass Ceiling.